Well, we all really want to find a space of belonging. Every single one of us longs for meaningful times of connection. And we know what that feels like when we get it. We know what it feels like to have a really good laugh with great friends or to have people around us when we're in a hard season. We know what it feels like to be seen and known and understood. And probably we also know what it feels like to experience the other side. We know what it feels like to feel unseen and unknown and ununderstood. We know what it feels like to feel outside and like we don't have a space of belonging and we're wrestling to try and find a sense of fit. And both of these things leave a really strong impression on our souls because we have been created to live in a dynamic kind of community. And this need for community goes so deep that if we can't find belonging in healthy and right ways, we will probably find it any way that we possibly can. And today we want to look at the story of someone who journeyed from a space of being outside and alienated into a space of belonging and see how it connects with our lives as well. Today we're going to take a brief look at the beginning of the life of Moses. And Moses, the beginning of his life, was complicated to say the very, very least. Moses was born at a terrible time for his people. The people of Israel had moved into Egypt centuries before, and they'd grown and they'd thrived and they'd prospered, but the Egyptians began to fear them. And so they subjected them, they pushed them down, they oppressed them, they moved them into lives of slavery. And this wasn't even enough for them. Pharaoh was still afraid of the people of Israel. And so he commanded that every baby boy for a time would have to be thrown into the Nile River so that it would die in order to weaken this nation of people living within his country. And into the middle of this context, Moses is born, as we see at the beginning of Exodus chapter 2. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. She placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Again, can you imagine the fear and the anxiety and the stress into which Moses was born? Likely the very instant that Moses was born, his whole family erupted in an experience of grief and wailing and weeping because he was a boy and they were going to have to end his life. And as his mother picked up this child that she'd just given birth to, and she looked at him, she just knew she couldn't do it. She just couldn't end his life like the law required of her. And so they hide him for 3 months. Can you imagine 3 months of stress and fear and anxiety and secrecy, trying to hide the presence of this child from your closest friends and all the people around you, because if they also have had to kill their own children, they're certainly going to not let you get away with keeping yours. Can you imagine the isolation of those moments for this family? And all of this hiding. And so they do it for as long as they possibly can, but after 3 months they realize, we just can't do this anymore. The risk and the danger to the whole family being killed is way too high, and so they have to end Moses' life. I can imagine his mother taking this basket and coating it with tar and pitch, just weeping uncontrollably as she prepares to set her child in it and send it off onto the Nile. This was the way she found to obey the law but not kill her child outright. This was her compromise with this evil rule. As they place this young child into this basket and set it afloat on the water, his sister travels with him for a while to see what on earth is going to happen to this child. And as it would happen, Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to bathe that day. And as God guided and directed her, she saw this basket and had it drawn over towards her. When she looked inside and saw the baby, she felt compassion for him. She knew that this child was one of the Hebrew children that her father had commanded be killed, but she just felt warmed inside to this child. And Moses' sister comes up and they have this interesting conversation. I would love to know what they said. Because at the end of it, she's convinced Pharaoh's daughter to allow Moses' own mother to nurse him and to raise him and to look after him until he's ready and grown up enough to come and to live in the palace. And when we hear this story, certainly what we remember most of all is just the amazing power of God to protect and preserve the life of Moses at the beginning of his journey. But could you imagine living through the complexity of this? Can you imagine how this must have felt for Moses? Again, his early years, he's raised with his own family in an environment where they are slaves, where they are oppressed, where they're pushed down, where they have no rights, they have no capacity, they have no ability. They're living in this difficult space of oppression. And then he gets taken out of that and moved all the way up into the palace, right into the family, the very family of the people who are oppressing and pushing down and killing his own people. Can you imagine the complexity of trying to move from understanding yourself as a slave with no rights and no capacity and no ability to walking right into the house of the people responsible for all of it as some part of the household? This would be complicated. And we don't know how much Moses knew or when. Did the other royal children around him know that he also was the children of slaves? Did they bully him? Did they push him down? Were there all kind of names that were called him throughout his whole childhood because they knew he wasn't one of them? Did Moses struggle with survivor's guilt, being the only one of the generation of the boys from his whole nation that survived? But certainly we can imagine Moses caught between these two cultures, between these two families, and he must have felt that he just didn't belong anywhere. And again, maybe for you and I, we haven't had something quite so dramatic. But I think that for a lot of us, we can identify with this feeling that we just don't fit. Maybe we feel like we just don't belong. Again, maybe you were adopted or grew up in foster care. Maybe your family made a significant journey. I remember growing up in an immigrant household and often having this feeling of I'm not being quite sure where I belong. I know I'm a part of this Canadian culture, but I know that some part of me also belongs somewhere else. And there's just spaces where I feel like I don't fit. And maybe it was something like that for you, or maybe it's just your interests or your experiences. Maybe just as you journey through life, you just feel somehow like you're having a hard time feeling like you truly belong. Like there's people who really know you and understand you and see you and love you to the depth of your being. You see, for so many of us, we can identify with this feeling that we just don't belong. And certainly we know that Moses was wrestling through this because we read later on. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them in their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. This is an interesting conversation. Again, Moses is feeling this wrestle. He's living in the royal palace, but he just has to know, what are my people really like? What is their day-to-day existence? What does their hard toil look like? What have we subjected them to? Who am I, and where do I belong? And so he goes out one day, and he just wants to see what's happening. What is the life of his people? And as he gets there, he sees an Egyptian beating one of his people. And in this really horrifying sentence, we find that he looks this way and that, and then he goes out and kills the Egyptian. Again, it seems like a little bit of an overstatement, right? You think maybe he could have gone out to him and said, excuse me, I don't know if this is the best way to go. I think could we treat this guy a little bit better than maybe you're treating him right now? But the interesting thing in the language that's used in this passage is Moses is really careful to make sure no one sees him going towards the Egyptian. But the wording that's used for how he kills him would seem to indicate to us that Moses didn't intend to kill this man. What likely happened is that Moses went up and hit him, and he just couldn't stop. And he hit him again and again and again and again until he beat this man to death. And you have to wonder, what kind of pain, what kind of isolation, what kind of alienation, what kind of uncertainty, what are the things that are churning in Moses' soul so much so that he cannot control himself? And once he starts to hit this man, he cannot stop until he has literally beat him to death. And then, presumably, he comes to his senses and realizes, what on earth have I done? And as so often we try and do, he takes the body, digs a hole in the sand, dumps it, and tries to cover it up, tries to pretend that nothing has ever happened. But then Pharaoh finds out about it. When Pharaoh finds out about him, the head of his own family at this current point in time, Pharaoh says, we just need to kill Moses. We've got to get rid of this problem and move it off to the side. And so Moses runs. Moses runs full of fear and full of shame. And can you imagine trying to unpack that experience? You go to your own people to try and find out what they're like, and you murder someone in an uncontrollable rage. And then the family that you've grown up with says, we should just kill you. And so Moses flees alone and isolated into the midst of the wilderness. And in that place, he finds a really great girl. And they get married, and he has a child, and life kind of moves on from one season to the next. But we realize that there's still this sense of alienation. There's still this isolation that's haunting the deep places of his soul. And we know this because we read, when Moses had his first child, he named him Gershom, saying, I have become an alien in a foreign land. This sense of isolation is so deep within Moses' soul that he names his child after it, to try and find some way to express the depth of how unbelonging he feels, how isolated his soul is. And again, maybe you and I have never experienced anything quite like Moses. But have you ever had a moment where you ran? Have you ever had a space where you ran in isolation and fear and in shame? Again, we can run in all kinds of different ways and for all kinds of different reasons. Again, maybe you got really hurt. Or maybe you just feel really inadequate or isolated or insignificant, and so sometimes maybe you run. But is it possible that out of the broken places in your soul and in mine, we have maybe done things that are so evil that they make us feel ashamed? And so we choose to hide. Again, maybe you ran literally. You moved locations. You found a new job. You created a new friend group. You shifted your dynamic around you so that you wouldn't have to face the reality of what you had just been through. Or maybe you just ran internally. Maybe you just chose to hide parts of yourself and to close them off from public view so that those around you would never know or see or experience the depths of these things that make you feel so afraid and ashamed. You see, the truth of the matter is that we could be sitting in this room today or watching online, wherever you may be, and everything could look fine. But maybe in the deep recesses of your soul, you are still running. You are still hiding. You are still feeling ashamed. Can I ask, what is it for you? Again, is it anger? Is it pornography? Was it an abortion? Is it the questions that you have racing through your soul around your sexual orientation or your sexuality? Did you steal something? Did you lie? Have you hurt someone? Did you end someone's life? Again, all of these things within us make us feel so afraid and so ashamed. And we have these things that we feel that we need to hide and cover and keep from view, but they make us feel so much more isolated. And again, maybe it was something that you've done, but maybe it was something that you had done to you. Maybe your life, past or present, contains some moments of violence or abuse that is so horrendous that you just feel this need to hide. And again, I can identify. I have memories of spaces that I just chose to bury and to hide away for a long time because they made me feel so small and ashamed that I just didn't know what to do with them. But maybe for some of us, this is our reality. And even as you sit in the midst of a room like this, or any room, or any crowd, you still just feel isolated. Because you feel like if the people around you really knew the truth of who you are, they could never love you. And on some level, you feel disqualified from the capacity to really be known or accepted or loved or to belong. Maybe you feel like Moses, that whatever these things are, just define your identity. Again, hopefully you haven't named your children after them, but again, maybe in the quiet moments of your soul, this is who you feel that you are. And so Moses went on like this, from one season into the next, looking after sheep and hanging out in the wilderness, until one day, as he's journeying up on the side of a mountain, he sees a bush that is blazing with fire, but is not consumed. And he says, I have to see this. I have to know what this thing is. And so he moves towards this bush, and we read, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned for their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. To this, Moses replies, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And he comes up with all these excuses. He says, I can't speak very well. I'm slow of speech. I'm slow of tongue. How can I possibly go? How could I go into the throne room at the center of the most powerful nation of the world at that time and just demand that they release their slaves? And Moses comes up with so many reasons why he shouldn't be the one to go. And I have to wonder if underneath all of those very real fears for Moses, if there was also this voice that said, I just can't go back. I just can't go back because there's a body lying in the sand because of me. I just can't go back because one part of my family abandoned me and pushed me down the river, and another part of my family tried to kill me and threw me out of the country. I can't go back and face the reality of all of this. And God, in his infinite grace and mercy, essentially says to Moses, I will be with you, and I will give you everything that you need. You see, I love this encounter. I love this moment between God and Moses because God knows every single thing there is to know about Moses. God knows all about the pain. He knows all about the shame. He knows all about the body buried in the dust. He knows all about the isolation of his childhood and the feeling torn between different worlds and not being sure how he fits. God knows every single part of Moses' story. And God reaches out to him and calls him by name. Moses. Moses. You see, God invites him into this beautiful relationship with himself. He speaks to Moses the wonder of his own name. He gives Moses a different kind of intimacy with God than many people had ever known before. With all that is broken and dysfunctional and damaged in Moses, God calls him out. And God gives him this beautiful, powerful, dynamic kind of purpose. You see, there's this whole nation, this whole race of people that are stuck in oppression and bondage and damaged and caught in slavery. And God cares about all of this. And God says to Moses, even though you feel small and inadequate and insignificant, I will send you into the throne room of the most powerful man in the world at that time, and you will demand that he sets my people free. And what I love about this is that God is doing this miraculous movement of redemption in Moses' life. You see, all the things from Moses' past that made him feel so small and insignificant and that he didn't belong are exactly the things that God needs in his life. He needs someone who understands both the royal court and both the identity of what it looks like to be a slave. He needs someone who understands the pain and the hardship and the fear and the oppression and what these people are like and what these people are like. And all of these things that made Moses feel so small are exactly the things that God uses to redeem and to transform and to free an entire nation of people. Because the thing is that God is just this good. God is just this powerful. God is just this tremendous and wonderful in all that he can accomplish. You see, God can take all the broken and damaged and wounded places in my soul and in yours, and he can breathe life and redemption and freedom and healing into these things on such a level that they can be used to transform not just our lives, but to free and to strengthen the lives of countless other people around us. He's just this good. And you know the truth today that God is calling your name. Again, maybe today you have tried to move on through so many different seasons of life. Maybe it's through marriage or having children or going through different grades. Maybe it's a different job or different environment, but every time you engage in a new season, you still feel all the same inadequacy and insecurity. Maybe you still feel the same sense of fear and the same sense of shame. Maybe you still wrestle to try and find some kind of a space to belong, regardless of where you are and what season you find yourself in. And the truth is that no matter who we are or where we are, God is calling your name. He knows every single thing about all those things that make you feel so small and inadequate and ashamed. He knows all about you. And he continues to reach out to you. He wants to draw you into this space of life and freedom and hope and healing. But God wants to do this in your life, but not just for you, but so that through your life, other people can experience the same sense of belonging and hope and freedom that he longs to give to you. You see, through Moses bringing the people out of slavery, God used this to create within Moses a place of belonging, to give Moses a people of his very own, where Moses would be used by God to lead them to be the very people of God. And as we choose to engage with God in this journey, he frees us and liberates us also to know this sense of acceptance and belonging within his presence, but also within the community of his people, because he's just this good. You see, the truth is that no matter what you're holding, no matter what it is that makes you feel small or different or inadequate or insignificant or ashamed, the God of the universe has come close all over again. And this time, God didn't come to you in a burning, flaming bush on the side of a mountainside without consuming it. This time, God chose to come to you and to me as a baby, born to two young people who were so poor that they couldn't even provide him a reasonable place to be born. And in Jesus, God drew close to us. He teaches us what it looks like to know God and to walk with him and to follow him every day, but he did so much more than that. In Jesus, God takes on himself the very weight of all of my evils and your evils and all the evils of the destructive patterns of the world around us, and he bears the weight of all of it himself. He suffers and dies and takes the punishment that is rightfully ours so that we can go free, so that we can experience this deep, rich, life-giving sense of belonging in the presence of God now and forever. This is the really good news of the presence of God. You never have to live defined by your past or the reality of the struggles of the present, because the God of all eternity and all glory is reaching out to me and to you. You see, every single one of us has been created to need this sense of belonging. And in the presence of Jesus, we find the belonging that our souls crave, that they desperately long for. And in the presence of Jesus, he also gives us one another to live life with. And today, for some of us, for the very first time maybe, Jesus is inviting you to engage in relationship with him, to hand over to him your life and to experience belonging as a part of his family, to experience freedom from shame and from all the weight of your sins so that you could know freedom with him. And again, today, if you want to begin a relationship with God through Christ, I want to ask you to do two things. First of all, I want to ask you to tell someone about it today before you leave this place. Again, tell a friend that you came with, tell one of the Prairie people at the front after the service, or even just find someone who looks really nice and tell them. And just so you can experience this sense of belonging. And also today, if you want to begin this relationship, you just simply need to ask God for it. So if you want to begin this relationship today, just pray something like this with me. Lord, I want to belong to your family. Would you forgive me for all of my sins? I give my life to you. Teach me to walk every day with you. Amen. And again, if you've done that today, welcome to the family. Welcome to this new space of belonging. We are delighted to get to know you more and journey with you now and throughout all of eternity within the presence of God. And this morning, for some of us who maybe already know Jesus, today is about hearing the gospel all over again. Because for so many of us, there are just these places in our lives. There are these spaces that make us feel small and inadequate and insignificant. There are these spaces where we feel so desperately ashamed that we continue to run, and this is not God's very best for us. So today, if you know Jesus and you have a relationship with him, but you still feel like you're lacking this sense of belonging, if you know that there are things that are causing you to hide, I also want to ask you to do two things. First of all, I want to ask you to talk to somebody about it. I know it feels terrifying and overwhelming, and you've already said, no, absolutely not. There's no way I'm going to do this. But just hear me out. Author and pastor John Ortberg has said, we can only ever feel loved to the extent that we are known. We can only ever feel that we belong to the extent that we are known. And the secrets that we keep us from feeling connected to one another. I certainly know from my own personal experience, the very best choices have always been to choose to be open and to be honest, to be vulnerable, even when it feels terrifying. Because it breaks the power of these things to make us feel ashamed and inadequate and to feel isolated and alone and lost in the middle of the world around us. And even though it may be challenging or difficult, it is always right and best. So I want to encourage you, where you have these things, just find a trusted friend, find someone close to you, maybe pray and ask God who you should talk to, and take a few moments just to share these things. I want to encourage you to do it soon. Do it today or really soon, otherwise we're going to chicken out, and we're never going to follow through because it's just going to seem overwhelming the longer that we wait. And the second thing that I want to encourage us to do is to bring these things into the presence of God. Again, it's only in the presence of God that we ever find healing for the parts of us that are broken or wounded or damaged. So what I want to encourage you to do, again, if you feel comfortable to do this, feel free. If not, just ignore me. But what I want to encourage you to do is just place your hands open and imagine with me that all of these things that make you want to run, all these things that make you feel ashamed or afraid or that you don't belong, just place these things in your hands. Imagine placing them in your hands and holding them open, fully visible before God. And then just talk to him about them. Where there's sins of yours, ask him for forgiveness. Where there's places where you have been wounded, ask him to bring healing. Where there's places of significant pain or isolation, or you just feel like you can't fit, just offer these things to God. Let's take a few moments to do that now. And then what I want to ask you to do is just ask God to move in these parts of your life to redeem them. And to redeem them in such a way that it's not just for you. To redeem them in a way where other people will experience freedom and hope, healing, and a sense of belonging to the transformational work that God will do in you. Just ask him to do this work within you now.